Yes?
Can you talk a bit about the tension between kids in the transition with more stress seen through their LEH, but their less stunting is also happening? So what is going on there?
So because the LEH those were essentially retrospective, so you can only score linear enamel hypoplasias on adults. Mm-hmm. So it was in the past. So I think what we're seeing with the less stunting is an anomaly of a very short snapshot in time where you have this mixed diet. Remember that those who had an intermediate diet, where the weaning foods were essentially a combination of bush foods and wild foods, had an intermediate amount of linear enamel hypoplasias. So they were not malnourished. They weren't great, but they weren't actually malnourished. They were kind of average. So essentially that's what we're seeing. So the less stunting and wasting, essentially you have some in the green category for World Health Organization and you have some in the gold category. And the gold is okay, they're pretty much okay. So basically what we're seeing is that they're better off, even in this okay range, than they are when it's strictly bush foods or strictly village foods, because strictly village foods are also highly problematic because maize, of course, is energy rich but nutrient poor. And the Hadza often, not consistently, talk about why they eat maize flour is it makes their bellies feel full, which makes sense, right? So I think what we're seeing is this intermediate, this very short period of time where you have this intermediate range where a mixed diet may confer the best nutritional advantages, but they don't stay in that mixed territory for long. And it's also highly seasonally variable and annually variable because their access to wild foods is contingent upon rainfall patterns, is contingent upon, the expansion and contraction, well, not contraction anymore, the expansion of safari park boundaries, which means that you have game wardens who are monitoring all sorts of game movements now in order to make sure that the animals stay where they're supposed to stay so tourists can take pictures of them. So yeah, that's a great question, but I think it's just that in-between medium place is still better than malnourishment. But we need more data, more repeated measures, and then we'll know what's really going on. Yes?
We're seeing a greater conversion to agriculture and settled agriculture. Where is that coming from? Is that coming from the people themselves, or is it coming from the outsiders, like the government, NGOs, the missionaries, imposing, agriculture on them? And another question is, in terms of climate change, what other problems are they facing? Apparent, what can we see now they're facing apart from water stress? Because the water stress is a global problem, in addition to climate change. So what other level of insecurity are they facing apart from water stress?
Fantastic questions, so I'll take them in order. So the first question, I should have been more clear when I showed you the carbon Tanzania graphs, and I apologize for that. So the Hadza themselves are not farming. So while they're eating domesticated cultigens, while they are eating farmed foods, they themselves are not farming. This food comes from purchase, trade, or donation. It is neighboring communities, so largely the Iraqi farmers who are a neighboring ethnic group in the area who are farming. And the government is, you have a classic situation of land grabbing happening. So you have large parcels of highly valuable land being given to, oh my goodness, to mining companies, to essentially to safari park people, to wards, to essentially community wards, community areas, which are then being given over completely to farmers. And all of this is possible because the way that the Tanzanian constitution is written, the way that the government is structured, essentially the way it works is that the president of the country owns everything. And the president, whoever happens to be the sitting president, gets to dole out land as they see fit. They're considered the king, and all of their subjects fall in line with how it gets doled out to the wards. So in a given ward, whether or not land gets given to the Hadza is up to whoever the local leader is. There has been some success in terms of securing land that cannot be farmed, as I was telling you earlier, but that land, the Dotoga pastoralists were also pushed off the land, so they've also been marginalized. So you have an ever-shrinking amount of land that now has to go to arguably the two lowest ranking tribes in the country. the Hadza and the Datoga, and they have a very different subsistence economy, and so they're using the same amount of space. So the Hadza are not farming. There's not a good phrase, I don't really love the phrase that's often used, but when foragers are in this period of transition, Tom Headland, who worked with the Agta, called this particular period of transition, he referred to the community that he worked with as landless peasants. I don't love the term, but we lack the language to talk about what happens when foragers have no means of production, and they are reliant on other entities for their own survival. So they're not farming. The second part of your question, I hope to have a much better answer for you. Right now we're working on looking at satellite data to actually track land cover change in a different way than Carbon Tanzania has done. So using essentially freely available NASA imagery, we can do that starting from around 2000 and actually track the rate of land cover change. I'm hoping to get access to data from wildlife biologists who do flyover game counts. They're really not interested in the Hadza, of course. They're interested in climate change and their animal populations. But those data can then be used because we can superimpose Hadza territory and we know where that will be. So we're also looking at the reduction in terms of game animals from those flyover game counts. And it's significant. It's significant. And you take that and you compare it. So just this summer, I asked a lot of the old men, and we interviewed them in Hadzane because most of them don't know Swahili very well, not well enough to sit for an interview. And we asked them to talk about their changes that they've seen in terms of climate and what impact that has had on the populations of game animals in the area, and it's quite significant. So now we have the interview data, we can map it onto the quantitative data we get. Water, as you said, is an issue everywhere. There was a scare about, a year ago, I guess, a year or two ago, there was a scare that the water table was going to be even further reduced because they were going to put in an additional, they were going to somehow try to commercialize water. There's no water to take, but they wanted it closer for all the safari lodges, so they were going to try and do some like ancillary water production plant. That didn't work out. So it's pollinators in general, that's a huge problem. We're seeing across the African continent, not even just in Tanzania, not just for the Hadza, but pollinators are declining. This is particularly important for bird species. So I don't know if anybody saw there was a story.
Pollinators, you mean bees?
I mean bees, birds, and nighttime pollinators like bats. All of the pollinators that live in these East African areas are on the decline, which has a domino effect for the whole ecosystem. So bats, so people forget about nighttime pollinators. They're so important. So yeah, bees are on the decline, bats are on the decline. Even elephants, believe it or not, elephants have a very large range in which they travel in, typically, out, not when they're bounded by safari park boundaries. And based on what those elephants eat, their dung is a really important food source for a lot of animals. And so we're actually seeing declines in certain populations based on the fact that elephants aren't traveling as far as they used to. So it's every level. Market integration is increasing. So market integration is increasing. So they have more Hadza have cell phones. They have solar panels to charge those cell phones. Many of them are starting to engage in wage labor while they still continue to forage. And so this is a juxtaposition that only outside Westerners find jarring. To the Hadza themselves, this is how resiliency works, right? This is what it means to be a forager. You're already tethered to seasonality. You're already tethered to these annual changes and seasonal changes, and you're already dealing with a foraging economy that goes like this. So for them, they're just roping in new ways to remain resilient. But how we quantify that in a way that can actually affect positive change that's generated by the community for the community, stay tuned. We're hoping to see. Yes?
The domestic group size and composition play a role in the changes?
Yes, that's a great question. So the question was, does the domestic group play a role? Absolutely. And I think what we're seeing is much like what we see for things like oral health and caries formation. Women are faring far worse in this transition towards a market economy. We're already seeing it. So I have some anecdotal evidence. I interviewed camps that are engaging in tourism on an almost daily basis in the high season. So they're getting anywhere from 3 to 10 vehicles filled with tourists every day in these camps that are located on the periphery of villages. And in those camps, women do not get access to the money. So what's happening are all the tour operators are coming in from other tribes in the country that have a very different social structure, very different kinship structure. Women's roles are quite different, and so they will only pay. They elect a headman. So the Hadza are egalitarian. They don't have one of those, but it makes sense in their system of meaning. So they elect a headman of that camp, and now you have the formation of a big man in this indigenous community by the outsiders. And so the headman is the one who receives all of the money, and then it is up to that individual for how it gets dispersed. There is a lot of conflict and tension within the community themselves about how to handle this situation. And so I think women are faring the worst. I think that's part of it. I think in the bush, where you have the only tour operators who are currently operating in the bush have an understanding that the Hadza are egalitarian. And so they approach it slightly differently, which means that women have control over more of the monetary resources that are coming in, and they're designating that money for food, specifically for the children who are constantly complaining of hunger during certain parts of the year. So I think that I don't have a direct answer, but I think we will. So with longitudinal data collection, we will be able to figure out how essentially household structure both impacts and is being impacted by these changes. And I will go back because I failed to mention one thing. There it is. I wanted to talk about the importance of longitudinal data. So Shana knows this person. So this is my friend named Blongu, and this is also for you, Noah. That was his very first Akame animal. And he was quite young. He was 12 or 13. And nobody believed him when he came back to camp and he said, I killed this big animal, and everyone laughed. They were like, oh man, they thought he had maybe been smoking marijuana and was not telling the truth. And he said, no, I'm telling you, I need help. I can't even butcher it by myself. So he comes back, and lo and behold, he killed this very large animal. And so he's very proud of himself, so he took this picture. And this is him just a month ago, just 5 weeks ago, same guy. And he brought back another animal and said, hey, you want to take my picture? And I said, yes. So we have longitudinal data. We can actually look at who people are living with and how their residential choices are impacted by this shifting economy, because I think they very much are. And people are talking about food and water insecurity and access to village towns and participation in tourism as a motivator for who they're choosing to live with during this time. So they're talking about very different things. It's not who's the most generous sharer anymore, who's the best tuber digger. It's totally, all of those metrics are changing. It's very fluid at the moment. Yes. Yes, you. Yes.
Yeah, I was just wondering, with the male and female health differences, could sort of some factor within that be anything to like, so I'm talking about specifically the smoking and things like that. Could that be anywhere associated to like proliferation of hypermasculinity and things like that? So anything sort of socially rooted in sort of health differences essentially?
I certainly think that differential access to resources as they're transitioning away from domesticated foods is socially rooted, because they're now just adopting the social system of outside groups. So yes, in terms of women's decline in health, and I think that the converse is also true, that the reason that men have elevated health outcomes in the village is because they have greater access to resources, they have access to money, they have access to social power in ways that they simply don't when they're living in those bush communities where things tend to be relatively more equal. In terms of the health effects, we're also starting another project, and this is legal in Las Vegas, but not legal in Tanzania. But so the Hadza have specifically asked for me to start an ethnographic study of marijuana consumption. So so that's going to be interesting, IRB approval. But So this new thing that I'm doing is I've decided that every time I go into the community, I would like to do work that benefits everyone, questions that I'm interested in that push science forward, questions that hopefully can benefit the community in some way, and also do stuff that's out of my wheelhouse, but that they're specifically asking for. So one of the things that they asked for, that another project that I don't have pictures of, but we started doing an ethnomusicology study this summer, and we're now, they loved it so much, and so everybody who participated was like, yes, do more of this, more of this. And I had two different men come up to me before I left, and they said, yeah, this is great, it's just what we wanted. Now, we would like you to study marijuana because we want the world to know how important this is to Hadza hunting proficiency. So of course, you try to be the good anthropologist. Yes, yes, yes. But I was like, what? Hunting proficiency? They're like, oh yeah, nobody ever asks us about this, and it's so important. And the more we smoke, like the more alert our senses are. And they're like, the best hunters smoke the most. And I'm like, oh, this is a headline, right? California native who now lives in Las Vegas studying marijuana, smoking, I can only imagine what the headlines are going to read. Nevertheless, this is something the community's asked for, and so I think in terms of the smoking, we'll have to wait and see, but I definitely think that there's been a study in another population looking at how smoking marijuana may reduce helminth load, so may actually reduce essentially parasite burden. So if you smoke a lot of marijuana, it helps with worms, helps decrease your helminth load. So I don't know if we would find that in the Hadza, but we found it for another forest population, the Aka, in the Central African Republic. So I would not be surprised if there were similar results with the Hadza, which would mean that men have a lower parasite burden essentially than their female counterparts if they're indeed smoking more frequently than women. So, yes?
Yes, it's a little bit away from your topic, but can you say what effects these changes have had on the symbolic consciousness and the ritual life of that?
I can defer to my esteemed colleague, Dr. Camilla Power.
Well, you will have much more
recent
made data, but I was going to try to combine that question with digging more at the issues of gender egalitarianism, particularly, because maybe there'll be plenty of people here who aren't aware to the extent that you referred to egalitarianism, traditional egalitarianism, and how household structures and kinship and who you choose to live with is being changed. But in the bush life, women and they're kind of matriarchies are central to the camps in the bush life. The women and their relatives, and this is the famous context of the Hadza grandmothers, of course, which some people may not realise. So we're looking at the total change of all that, and you're talking about the impact particularly on young women and girls in terms of mobility, which they used to have complete.
That's right.
Well, we can't say complete freedom of mobility. They always used to women were always together because of the risk of being out and alone. You wouldn't necessarily live alone, but they were always together. But yeah, things that are changing that I'm really interested in, as Robin says, mission, because when I was in Hadza country, they were getting donations from missionaries. They were getting missionaries building churches. They used to keep goats in the churches. They were very resilient against the attempts of the missionaries.
Absolutely.
And I wonder how much that's really changed, but maybe it has, because the ritual life is being degraded. The Hadza's own ritual life perhaps is now becoming degraded comparatively. It would be interesting to know what you think anecdotally. I know you may not have.
I have interview data that I can speak to. So I'll address this question first, kind of more general, and then I'll kind of try to drill down on some of these specifics. Do I have another hour? Because that's
it's a big topic.
So it's a big topic, but I think so. I have only interview data from this last field season. So it's here. I have not even analyzed. I haven't even done thematic content analysis, but I'm just going off, and this can often be wrong. For any of you who've taken interviews yourself, kind of what you remember may turn out to actually not be the most salient thing when you go back and look, but based on what I can recall from my interviews this summer, there are definitely changes in terms of ritualism. So the types of kind of secret rituals, so how you become a man, how you become a woman, and my colleague right here in the front row has written about both of those. But those rituals are changing. They're changing in terms of the tenor, they're changing in terms of frequency, they're changing in terms of a lot of the elderly kind of keepers of the stories and the material, and kind of those who have all the institutional knowledge of how these rituals play out, they're dying. And often with them, the knowledge of how to carry out some of these rituals. So some of the artifacts that are used in a lot of these dances and in a lot are rotting. So one thing is ostrich feathers are really important. It's very, very difficult to find ostrich feathers. So when some of these ritualistic materials are falling apart, it's becoming increasingly difficult to replace them. The way that beads are treated as a currency has totally changed and is now being kind of moved into a market economy. So I used to talk about a Hadza woman's bank account as the number of beads that they would wear around their waist where you wouldn't see it, unless you were a woman or you were a spouse of a woman. And they would just have layers and layers and layers and layers of beads. And now they're almost totally depleted because those beads are very valuable. They're an actual currency now in terms of a market economy. And those beads, of course, I don't have the picture, but I can show you afterward. Of course, those beads are now being converted. I tell you, they're such smart businesswomen. They now take these small baobab fruits, turn them into like a little hollowed out dried gourd, and then they'll bead on the outside and make a little hook of sometimes like porcupine quills or plant material. And they're selling Christmas ornaments to tourists that are coming from the US and Europe. They have no idea what the hell a Christmas ornament is. But they know that white people who come like to buy these things to hang them on some plant at their house. So that, these beads are now currency. So the only thing, I know that Shayna has worked with the Hadza, and when she went out with the women, she just brought tons and tons and tons of beads. And that's what they want, because hopefully they'll be lucky enough to keep some of the really special ones back for their own little private bank account. But for the most part, those are being used. So material culture is changing. These rituals are changing. It's
Can you just perhaps
all in
remind
flux.
this group here, what you're talking about? You just mentioned what the rituals are, what they're called.
Sure, we
what
can.
they do.
Yes, I can. I was trying not to, but I will, Chris.
No,
I will
try
for you.
to.
I was trying not to, yeah. So these are very sacred rituals, and the kind of male rite of passage and the female rite of passage. And one is associated with something called a peme, which is a ritual, but it is also a type of game animal, a very large game animal. And there's a whole bunch of ritualistic things that go along with killing your first large game animal. And then you become an epeme man, so you are a man. It is your rite of passage, and you transition into being a man. And there's a bunch of ritualized things that happen once you kill one of these animals, and you're now able to participate in this very sacred dance that happens at night and eat certain cuts of the game animal. It's kind of like Fight Club. Like, you never talk about Fight Club, right? But it's very important, and the female ritual is maitako, which is a female circumcision ritual. And I just learned at dinner tonight that one of our colleagues, Thea Scans, has some really interesting stuff on that, which may be emerging in terms of the way that ritual might be changing. And I don't have anything on that right now, only other than I know that with increased missionization and increased impact of traveling nurses and with missionaries, Hadza women are reporting that they're engaging in the practice much less frequently, and they're afraid to talk about it. They're afraid to talk about it because they're afraid they'll be arrested. And interestingly enough, in this community, it is by women, to women and for women, it is considered to be a very empowering ritual, and it's the way that you become a woman, and it has been criminalized and villainized all over the continent of Africa, but especially in Tanzania. And so I think there's a lot of fear that this traditional cultural practice will get them into trouble.
Sorry, is this female circumcision?
Yes. Yep. Female circumcision. Yes. So we don't have any rates on that, so I haven't collected any data on that. Anytime that I talk to them about it, I tell them, I promise them I won't publish anything on it. So for me, I haven't collected anything. I can just tell you anecdotally that the practice has changed.
Sorry to interrupt, is that indigenous to Hadza? Because I've never heard of that before.
I have a great paper I can send you. It's published in the journal.
It is indigenous to the...
So there is some debate. Camilla, can I lob it over
sure.
you to answer that quick one?
Yeah, as far as we understand it, well, the Hadza are definitely using it for their own purposes, within their own culture, within their own milieu. Whether it has historically come from the farming Iraq or it doesn't fit though that it looks as though it comes from other cultures.
They claim that it is their own.
Well, I have thought about it.
So it's my understanding that they claim that this is their practice and that it's substantially different from the practice of neighboring groups. And one of the things that the women talk about is that the women own it and it's empowering, which makes it fundamentally different from the practice in other communities, which when they hear that men are engaging in this practice without women's consent, they're horrified, shocked. And so it's their own telling of the ritual is very different from the meta-narrative of the practice on the continent, which is what makes it a really tricky thing.
It is one of the only places that I'm aware of where women do some genital cutting, but men actually don't.
That's right.
And it's almost never like that. And it's also one of the only places, the only hunter-gatherer group which has this.
That's right.
So it's a real puzzle.
It's a real
and that's
puzzle.
why myself and my research student Eleanor, we were very interested in talking with Hadza women about it because it's a big puzzle.
Right.
But it always came over to us as something that women owned and women were deciding to do.
Yes. And it's even further complicated because now traveling nurses are telling women that female circumcision is wrong and horrible and terrible and disgusting, but male circumcision is necessary and vital. And so what they're doing is they're now trying to circumcise young male infants who are getting infections because foreskin is quite useful. It's a quite useful thing if you live in the dirt without a nappy. So there's a real juxtaposition there that's very confusing internally and externally. Even for me, I struggle to find a way to explain that principle to the women I work with. You can't do this thing because you may be arrested, but now you are being told you must do this other thing, which can essentially potentially kill your infant.
So at what age are the women circumcised, the female?
Well, now, I can answer this. Now the age range is changing. So the age range is changing to become more inclusive, a larger age range because the practitioners are dying. And so you have fewer practitioners who women feel are skilled enough to actually do the ritual. So I've seen the youngest one I've seen or heard about in recent years was like 8, which is young. So like 8 to 15.
3.
3, Shayna. Oh my God. Okay, so my graduate student has said, soon not to be my graduate student. Very soon she'll be Dr. Levy. 3. Okay, so now we're talking about a huge age range because you need the practitioners available or they won't do it. Not everybody can do this. So, but they might be changing, and I don't know if I can share.
Well,
can I share what you told me at dinner?
It's an experience. I mean, we're really unclear. There's so little clarity on what was the history of this practice. There is, James Woodburn collected data in the 60s, and we had some more experience early this century, and Teo in about 2010. And she was going through. She actually engaged in the ritual and did it herself, which was fantastic of her. But it was cutting on the torso.
Yeah, so it was right
instead.
here. It was
So
kind of
it-
right at the belt line,
creating
and that's where the cutting happened. So
Yeah.
whether this is a shift.
Is it a shift in relation to Tanzanian law?
Right.
Is it that they were explaining it in terms of dry season, wet season? We just don't know what the variability is. But it's very interesting to hear about the variability of age
Yeah.
now, because
And I didn't know
that would
that's-
never have happened before.
That wouldn't have happened
Wow.
10 years ago.
You were basically mitopole is relating to monarchical ritual
That's right.
in some as a sequence fundamentally.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
So it's your rite of passage as a woman, and you're now able to essentially.
In the procedure, are they just removing the clitoral hood? Are they doing a...
We're not sure.
well,
There's a lot of variability.
There is a lot of variability. We are very unsure about.
So some women have reported to me confidentially that it's just that it's not removal. It's essentially just some cutting. And some argue, some say that it's just the labia. Some say that it's. We don't know.